Mr. Brooks, your claret burden is alarmingly aerial and you acquire annoying acoustic symptoms. You charge to go to the hospital now, said the charwoman adult with a compactness that bogus the billionaire CEO stopped shouting on the phone. Richard Brooks, 53, buyer of a biologic authority account $2 billion, looked at the 42-year-old atramentous woman as if she had aloof announced Chinese. Kesha Washington stood there in her uniform, Captivation Charwoman Supplies, accepting the adventurousness to accord him medical advice. Alibi me. Richard laughed derisively, blurred his corpuscle phone. Are you giving me medical admonition now? What is your accomplishments again? Avant-garde cleaning. The acrimony cut through the air of the comfortable appointment on the 30th attic of the Brooks Biologic Tower. Kesha had aloof witnessed Richard staggering, his easily shaking, and his apperception abashed during a video appointment meeting. Affection she accustomed immediately, but which all the admiral present absolutely ignored. Sir, I'm not just Kesha began, but was interrupted. Your annihilation but a charwoman lady, Richard growled, his face red with irritation. Go back to your chemicals, and let me run my aggregation in peace. An abutting time, apple pie in silence. What Richard didn't apperceive was that Kesha Washington had been a registered assistant for 15 years afore accident aggregate in a bogus scandal. A case of ancestral bigotry so barbarous that it affected her to booty charwoman jobs to survive. But her medical apperception never chock-full working. She had noticed the signs for weeks. The slowed coordination, the accidental slurred speech, the episodes of disorientation that Richard absolved as business stress. All the affection acicular to austere acoustic action that if larboard basic could be fatal. I acquire perfectly, Mr. Brooks, Kesha replied with a bashing calm. I'll accumulate accomplishing my job. But while Richard alternate to his million-dollar calls, Kesha did article he would never expect. She began anxiously documenting everything. Every symptom, every episode, every moment aback his heirs overcame his adaptation instinct. Richard Brooks' anticipation he had complete ascendancy over his aggregation and the bodies beneath him. What he didn't apprehend was that the woman who bankrupted his appointment was befitting a abstruse that could save his activity if he chock-full actuality aloof abundant to listen. As Kesha agilely organized her charwoman supplies, her accomplished eyes connected to observe. She knew absolutely what was accident with Richard Brooks. And added importantly, she knew absolutely what to do about it. If you've any time been underestimated because of your blush or amusing status, afresh you apperceive that sometimes the best animus is artlessly actuality appropriate aback anybody abroad is wrong. Subscribe to the approach to acquisition out how an unimportant charwoman adult would become the abandoned actuality able of extenuative the activity of the man who abhorred her. 3 canicule later, Richard Brooks was worse, but his heirs had tripled. During an controlling lath meeting, Kesha witnessed him abash the names of his own admiral and echo the aforementioned catechism 3 times in 10 minutes. Aback she anxiously approached to bright the appointment table. She overheard bits of the chat that abashed her. Richard, are you okay? You assume abashed today, James Morrison, the CFO, murmured with 18-carat concern. Confused, Richard exploded, slamming his anchor on the table. I'm altogether fine. Maybe you're not befitting up with my thinking. I've consistently been 3 accomplished avant-garde of everyone. Kesha saw the attenuate agitation in his larboard hand. The way he blinked afresh as if aggravating to focus his vision. Accelerating acoustic affection, she had apparent abounding times afore aback she formed in the neurology administration at Metropolitan Hospital afore she was destroyed professionally. The aspersion had amorphous 5 years ago aback Kesha, a fresh arch assistant on the night shift, about questioned Dr. Mitchell Barnes's boundless opioid prescriptions. She had accurate that atramentous patients were consistently accustomed lower doses of painkillers than white patients with identical altitude, while actuality added bound labeled as biologic seekers. Are you accusing an admired doctor of racism? Asked hospital administrator Dr. Patricia Wells during the antidotal meeting. Based on what accurate evidence? Based on 15 years of acquaintance and 200 pages of abundant documentation, Kesha replied, agreement her accurate assay on the table. But the centralized assay was a sham. Dr. Barnes was a claimed acquaintance of the CEO and an adequate donor to the hospital. Instead of reviewing her evidence, they created an addition narrative. Kesha was emotionally ambiguous and bulging claimed issues of chase assimilate medical practice. The final draft came aback they apparent that she had allegedly abandoned medication protocols, bogus allegations they could never prove, but which were abundant to abort her career. Oral 6 months, she absent her license, her reputation, and any achievement of any time alive in the medical acreage again. People like you consistently anticipate the apple owes you something, Dr. Barnes had said on her aftermost day with a smile that didn't adeptness his eyes. Maybe it's time to acquire that some places aloof aren't for you. Now 5 years later, charwoman out the appointment of the best able man in the biologic industry, Kesha acquainted absinthian irony. Richard Brooks endemic the aggregation that bogus the actual opiates Dr. Barnes had selectively prescribed. Are you still here? Richard's aciculate articulation brought her aback to the present. The affair was over, and he was watching her with irritation. How connected does it booty to apple pie a desk? I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks. I was aloof actuality thorough. Thorough. He laughed dismissively. You're a janitor, not a surgeon. Acceleration affairs, added than accomplishment in your band of work. Kesha nodded silently, but her accomplished eyes connected to Annal's details. Richard's appropriate adherent was hardly added aggrandized than his left. His exact responses had an attenuate delay. His accomplished motor allocation was acutely impaired. Archetypal signs of added intracranial pressure. An addition thing, Richard continued, adjusting his tie with beneath absolute movements than usual. Next time you acquire the ablaze abstraction of giving me medical advice, bethink that I pay some of the best doctors in the country. I don't charge the assessment of addition who cleans toilets for a living. The accidental animality of his words cut deep. But Kesha kept her announcement neutral. She had abstruse to blot abasement afterwards reacting, an accomplishment developed over years of analytical discrimination. I acquire perfectly, sir, she replied, alpha to put abroad her charwoman supplies. But as she larboarded the office, Kesha bogus a decision. That night, in her baby apartment, she opened her laptop and began to type. Not an academic medical report. She no. Best had the accreditation for that. Instead, she began article different, an abundant bearding letter to Richard's wife, Margaret Brooks. Kesha had researched the Brooks ancestors extensively. Margaret was an accomplished nurse, admitting she hadn't accomplished in years. She would acquire the medical agreement and admit the calmness of the affection described. Each chat was anxiously chosen. Each affirmation accurate with Spinozic precision. Each ascertainment backed up by specific behavioral evidence. She accomplished the letter at 3 o'clock in the morning, reread it Bristles Times, and slipped it into an bare envelope. Richard Brooks' anticipation, he had silenced addition inferior person. What he didn't apperceive was that he had aloof alive article far added alarming than anger. A accomplished assistant with a mission to save lives, alike back those lives accord to bodies who abhorred her. As Kesha bankrupt the envelope, a algid authoritativeness acclimatized in her chest. She would not acquiesce Richard's heirs to annihilate him. Not because he adapted to live, but because she had affidavit to save lives. And some oaths transcend the assay we acquire from the bodies we save. What that billionaire CEO couldn't see was that every insult abandoned adequate the boldness of a woman who had already absent aggregate already, and apparent she still had a lot to action the apple if anyone was apprehensive abundant to listen. The letter accustomed in Margaret Brooks easily on a quiet Tuesday delivered anxiously by an bearding courier. Margaret, a nursing alum from Johns Hopkins University, anon accustomed the analytic attention of the accent and the calmness of the observations described. Accelerating acoustic symptoms, broken motor coordination, episodes of Spinozic confusion, she murmured, accounted for the third time. Each chat echoed the affair she herself had approved to accurate to her bedmate over the accomplished few weeks. Abandoned to be absolved with the aforementioned antipathy he aloof for inferior people. Margaret knew Richard was different. The affronted outbursts had become added, accepted, and irrational. He forgot important appointments, again the aforementioned belief at banquet parties, and his already categorical autography now trembled like that of an abundant beforehand man. Who could acquire accounting this? She wondered, cloudburst over every anxiously accurate medical detail. Addition with academic training, definitely. Addition who watched Richard closely, regularly. Meanwhile, on the 30th attic of Brooks Pharmaceutical, Kesha accomplished her plan with the attention of an acclimatized nurse. During her charwoman rounds, she had anxiously amorphous documenting everything. Times of episodes, acuteness of tremors, patterns of brainy confusion. She had an abrupt ally, Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired neurologist who formed part-time as a medical allowance advisor in the architecture abutting door. Kesha had met her in the parking lot back. Patricia commented on acquainted nursing techniques in the way Kesha helped an aged woman who had stumbled. You were a nurse, Dr. Williams had observed. Not as a question, but as a fact. For 15 years, Kesha had admitted cat and mouse for the accepted judgment. Instead, Patricia captivated out her hand. Neurologist for 30, and I still admit adequacy aback I see it. That accidental chat in the parking lot angry into an absurd partnership. Dr. Williams, a 62-year-old atramentous woman who had faced her own battles adjoin ageism in medicine, accepted and on aback Kesha declared Richard's symptoms. Academician tumor, aneurysm, or article accelerating like assorted sclerosis. Dr. Williams had diagnosed during their chat at the Bend Cafe. Any one of those could be baleful if larboard untreated. Acquire you been documenting aggregate carefully? Kesha showed her handwritten anthology area she had anxiously recorded every observation. Patricia nodded with able approval. This man should acquire been adeptness acoustic tests for weeks. His heirs is activity to annihilate him. Their plan was simple. Provide abundant affirmation for Margaret Brooks to appeal a complete acoustic evaluation. But Richard was authoritative yet difficult with his analytical abnegation to exceed any problem. Dr. Harrison told me I may be alive too hard. Richard had commented to Margaret over dinner. Not acumen, he had referred to the dermatologist as if he were his cardiologist. But I don't assurance adolescent doctors. They adopt to analyze problems that don't exist. Margaret had exchanged a frayed glance with her daughter, Jessica, who was visiting for dinner. Jessica, a medical apprentice in her final year, had additionally noticed the changes in her father. Dad, aback was the aftermost time you had a complete checkup? Jessica had asked delicately. Checkups are for ailing people, Richard had replied with growing irritation. I congenital a biologic empire. I anticipate I apperceive a back article is amiss with my own body. It was that aforementioned anniversary that the best alarming adventure occurred. Kesha was acclamation the appointment allowance aback Richard absolved invisibly confused. Where is everyone? He asked, attractive about the abandoned room. The affair was cancelled, Mr. Brooks. You can let it yourself yesterday, Kesha replied gently. Richard stared at her with a bare expression, as if he didn't admit her, alike admitting she had been charwoman his appointment accustomed for 2 years. Who are you? He asked with a mixture of abashing and irritation. I'm Kesha from the charwoman staff. Kesha. He again her name several times as if aggravating to admission a absent memory. You said article about doctors earlier. For an alarming moment, Kesha saw in Richard's aggrandized pupils the aforementioned absent attending she had apparent in acoustic patients during her years in the hospital. The actuality abaft those eyes was gradually disconnecting from reality. Mr. Brooks, are you activity all right? She asked momentarily, apathy her position. The catechism seemed to breeze him back. I'm fine, he growled, abiding to his familiar, adverse personality. And you're not accustomed to ask claimed questions. Get it back to your work. But Kesha had apparent enough. That afternoon, she alleged Dr. Williams. Time is alive out, she said. Today, he didn't admit me for several minutes. This isn't aloof arrogance. It's a live acoustic deterioration. Afresh we charge to acceleration up the plan, Patricia replied. I'll alarm Margaret Brooks directly. As a doctor, I can use able affair as an excuse. That night, while Richard slept heavily, addition annoying affirmation Margaret had noticed. She accustomed to alarm from Dr. Williams. Mrs. Brooks, this is Dr. Patricia Williams, neurologist. I acquire accustomed some apropos advice about your husband's affection, and I acquire he needs actual acoustic evaluation. Margaret captivated the buzz with abashed hands. Doctor, I've been aggravating to argue him to seek help, but he refuses to listen. I acquire completely. Unfortunately, it is accepted for patients with acoustic altitude to lose the adeptness to admit their own symptoms. This is alleged anosognosia, aftereffect of the ache itself. The chat lasted 40 minutes. Aback she afraid up, Margaret had a plan. The abutting day, she would do articles she had never done in 25 years of marriage. She would accost Richard about an avant-garde of bodies whose opinions he valued. She had arrived the lath of admiral to an breezy ancestor's affair to alticate the assumption of the company. But in reality, it would be a medical action in disguise. Kesha, anxiously charwoman the alley adjoining to the appointment room, listened as Margaret explained the bearings to Jessica and the directors. My bedmate is sick, and his abnegation to acquire a say is putting not abandoned his activity at risk, but the approaching of the company. What none of them knew was that in the abutting 24 hours, Richard Brooks' activity would depend absolutely on the adventuresomeness of a charwoman adult he had advised as invisible. A woman who, admitting all the antipathy she had received, was about to do article that would ascertain not abandon her character, but possibly save the activity of the man who had ashamed her the most. Sometimes the greatest animus is not antibacterial someone. It is extenuative them admitting their unworthiness, proving that your altruism is consistently above to the animality you acquire received. But would Richard's pride acquiesce him to acquire advice from addition he had consistently advised inferior? And what happens aback extenuative activity agency adjoin an absolute arrangement that prefers to avoid the acumen of those it considers worthless? The ancestor's action took abode on a bitter Thursday aloof aback Richard was at his best vulnerable. Margaret had orchestrated aggregate with the attention of an accomplished nurse. She arrived the bristles top admiral of Brooks Biologic to a cardinal assumption affair at the ancestor's mansion. Richard descended the stairs, amazing slightly, aggravating to beard his compromised allocation with advisedly apathetic movements. His larboard ancillary was acutely weaker, and his accent occasionally slurred at the edges of words. "I don't acquire why we charge to alticate succession," he decrepit to Margaret as he adapted his tie with abashed fingers. "I'm altogether able of alive my own company." "Of advance you are, dear," Margaret replied, watching as he approved to tie his tie 3 times afore accomplishing an adequate knot. "It's aloof antitoxin planning." In the boardroom, the Admiral anon noticed the changes in Richard. James Morrison, the CFO, exchanged afraid glances with Sandra Phillips, Arch of Operations. Aback Richard referred to the business administrator as that guy from the sales department. Richard, Dr. Williams, who Margaret had arrived as a medical advisor for executives, interjected, "I've empiric some adverse affection during our antecedent meetings. Tremors, spasmodic confusion, broken coordination. There's annihilation amiss with me." Richard exploded, slamming his anchor on the table adamantine abundant to beating over his coffee cup. "I'm annoyed of amateur bodies aggravating to analyze me." That was the moment it happened. Richard approved to angle up to authenticate his absolute health, but his legs gave out completely. He burst into his chair, the larboard ancillary of his face alpha to beat involuntarily, his eyes accident focus as he struggled to anatomy words. I don't wear," he slurred, his appropriate Duke afraid berserk as he approved to adeptness for the bottle of water. Margaret anon dialed 911, but it was Dr. Williams who took ascendancy of the situation. "Acute acoustic symptoms, accessible achievement or accessory seizure. We charge actual carriage to the hospital." While cat and mouse for the ambulance, article abrupt happened. Margaret accustomed to alarm from addition she didn't expect. "Kesha, Washington. Mrs. Brooks, this is Kesha from your husband's appointment charwoman crew. I'm calling because I charge you to apperceive that I've accurate all of his affection over the accomplished few weeks." Margaret about abandoned the phone. "You're a nurse." "I was. Afore I was affected to apple pie offices by bodies who amusement me like I'm invisible." The acerbity in Kesha's articulation was palpable. But there was article else. Absolute medical competence. Your bedmate has archetypal signs of an academician bump or aneurysm. The accelerating symptoms, the cerebral decline, the unilateral tremors. It's all accurate in my report. What report? The one I beatific to all of his aggregation Admiral 3 canicule ago. The aforementioned one they abandoned because it came from a bald charwoman lady. Margaret acquainted the claret cesspool from her face. You beatificate to the directors. 47 pages of abundant medical observations with absolute timestamps and affirmation analysis. Alike a cast of abasement if larboard untreated. James Morrison said it was agent paranoia and Sandra Phillips appropriate, I be assured, for inappropriate behavior. The adumbration hit Margaret like a bite in the stomach. As Richard was loaded into the ambulance, she accomplished the abounding irony. The woman her bedmate had advised with the best antipathy was the abandoned actuality who had approved to save his life. At the hospital, Dr. Chen's analysis accepted every chat Kesha had said. Apathetic bleeding academician aneurysm causing accelerating acoustic symptoms. If it weren't for the action today, he would acquire suffered a complete breach oral a few days. Death was about certain. Aback Richard regained alertness afterwards emergency surgery. His aboriginal words were a hoarse whisper. Area is the charwoman lady? Margaret captivated his hand, still anemic from the sedatives. Kesha, she's in the hallway, dear. She's been cat and mouse for 6 hours. She approved to acquaint me. She approved several times. And you advised her like trash. Richard bankrupt his eyes, tears alive bottomward his anemic cheeks. I charge to allocution to her. Aback Kesha entered the room. Richard could almost authority her gaze. The woman he had about ashamed stood there, still cutting her charwoman uniform, but accustomed to a dress that bogus his antecedent airs assume affecting and small. You adored my life, he whispered. I've been aggravating to save it for weeks. You chose to abase me instead. I know. His articulation broke. I apperceive I don't deserve your forgiveness, but you're right. You don't. Kesha pulled up an armchair and sat down, befitting an admiring distance, but I didn't save your activity for you. I adored it because I swore in adjuration to assure lives. And some oaths are bigger than the assay we acquire from the bodies we save. Richard's abasement was aloof beginning. In the canicule that followed, the adventure leaked out in full. The billionaire CEO who about died because he was too aloof to acquire to an assistant cleaner who had accurately articulate his affection weeks earlier. Sandra Phillips and James Morrison approved to awning up the scandal, but Margaret had kept copies of all the communications area they abandoned and ridiculed Kesha's medical concerns. Recordings of affairs area they appropriate battlefront her for inappropriate behavior went viral on amusing media. The media angry the case into a civic attribute of bigotry in the accumulated environment. Atramentus cleaner saves CEO, who looked bottomward on her, became the banderole for weeks. The Brooks biologic laugh of Admiral alleged an emergency meeting. The aggregation absent $300 actor in bizarre amount in 3 canicule, and Richard was affected to footfall bottomward briefly as CEO for medical accretion and absorption on animal assets policies. But the greatest abasement came aback Richard abstruse that Kesha had banned all offers of severance pay and paid interviews. I don't charge anyone's claret money, she told reporters. I charge this to serve as an example. Adequacy and address don't depend on diplomas or bark color. While Richard recovered from surgery, adverse weeks of concrete analysis to achieve his motor coordination, Kesha agilely alternate to her charwoman job. But now, every agent at Brooks Biologic advised her with the account she had consistently deserved. The man who had spent his absolute activity analytical inferior bodies had abstruse in the best base way accessible that his activity depended on the actual bodies he advised invisible. And the accomplished Apple was watching his assignment in abasement actuality served on the civic news. But did Richard absolutely apprentice his lesson? And what would be the fate of a woman who accepted herself greater than all the ageism directed at her? Sometimes the greatest animus isn't antibacterial someone. It's banishment them to alive they owe their actuality to those they consistently advised inferior. 6 months later, Kesha Washington accustomed the Civic Heroine Award from the Surgeon General of the United States in a commemoration advertisement alive beyond the country. The aforementioned charwoman compatible that had been the accountable of badinage was now affected in the Civic Museum of African American History with an applique that read, "The compatible of a woman who accepted that adequacy has no color." Richard Brooks watched from the avant-garde row in a wheelchair, he still bare occasionally, due to the balance furnishings of surgery. His easily trembled slightly, no best from the disease, but from the effect of seeing the woman he had ashamed actuality acclaimed as she should acquire been from the beginning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kesha said into the microphone, her articulation alveolate through the arranged auditorium. "For 15 years, I was a nurse. For 5 years, I was advised as if I were invisible. But today, I acquire that I never chock full actuality what I consistently was, addition who saves lives, behindhand of who recognizes it or not." Brooks Biologic had been affected to apparatus desperate changes afterwards the scandal. Sandra Phillips and James Morrison were accursed for abominable conduct, and the aggregation created an assortment of affairs that became a civic model. Ironically, the company's banal recovered absolutely afterwards, it approved an absolute charge to inclusion. Dr. Patricia Williams, now medical administrator of the New Kesha Washington Convention for Antitoxin Medicine, smiled from the audience. The Institute, adjourned absolutely by a $10 actor bearding donation from Richard Brooks, offered chargeless medical training to bodies from underserved communities. "Aback that man told me to break in my place," Kesha continued. "He didn't apperceive that my abode has consistently been extenuative lives. He aloof couldn't see accomplished his own prejudices." Richard had approved to adeptness out to her several times during his recovery, but Kesha kept her ambit out of respect. Not out of anger, but because she accepted that some quaint charge be lived abandoned to be absolutely learned. The accessible abasement Richard faced was devastating, but transformative. He absent friends, amusing influence, and was affected to accost decades of accidental arrogance. But he additionally acquired article he never had, 18-carat abasement, an account for bodies he had consistently advised inferior. Revenge. Kesha assured her accent is not about authoritative addition pay for what they did to us. Accurate animus is acceptable so abundant that their pettiness can no best adeptness us. The acclaim lasted 8 minutes. Richard was one of the aboriginal bodies to stand, applauding with tears alive bottomward his face. Afterwards in the hallway, he assuredly got adventitious to allocution briefly with Kesha. I was an idiot, he said simply. You were, she agreed afterwards hesitation. But idiots can apprentice if they're apprehensive enough. Thank you for extenuative me. I like admitting I didn't deserve it. I didn't save you because you adapted it, Kesha replied, adjusting the medal on her chest. I adored you because some things are bigger than the essay we receive, and because the best way to effected ageism is to prove that our altruism is greater than the animality of others. Richard nodded. Alive, he would absorb the blow of his activity aggravating to acquire the absolution he had already received. Today, Kesha runs 3 association hospitals and trains doctors in avant-garde analytic observation. Richard has stepped abroad from business to allot himself absolutely to philanthropy, abnormally medical apprenticeship programs for minorities. 2 lives were adored that day, one from academician aneurysm, the added from terminal ignorance. The greatest animus adjoin those who cheapen us is not to abort them. It is to become so amazing that they absorb the blow of their lives aggravating to acquire how they could acquire been so blind. Kesha accepted that competence, dignity, and abundance do not depend on the approval of others, but abandoned on an abiding charge to actuality who we absolutely are. If this adventure affected your heart, subscribe to the approach for added belief that prove that our accurate backbone appears absolutely aback others try to abate us.